outrageous and as outlandish as this sounds, veterans are not good people, period. So proud to propose. I'll be starting my speech very simply, a few key pieces of characterization before going into my framing and providing the burden for this debate. And my arguments, of which I have two, will be the first on how veterans are not good people, and the second on the glorification of war overshadowing the carnage that has occurred historically. So, the first piece of characterization on the depictions of veterans. There's a positive depiction of veterans in status quo, mainly coming from nationalist propaganda in the form of veterans going for a parade after a war or celebrating the carnage they have committed, right? It looks like interviews of veterans who were forced to kill or killed for their home country, who they are depicted in a positive light even after the things that they have done and the things that they have experienced. And so what does that mean in the context of this motion? If we see veterans as good people, we see the people in power, the people who put them in these situations, the government, the organizations who put them in these positions in the first place, as making good decisions. If not good decisions, then at very least the best decision that you could have made, or the right decision for the situation. And what does this mean? We trust the government and their decisions more as a result. I'll be talking about why this is harmful actually in my arguments. Now for a bit of framing, right? It's not likely, understand, for the government to completely forego the protection of veterans or to completely disregard them, because if they did, we would have no soldiers. We would have no one new who was incentivized to partake in war in the first place. And so they have an incentive to give people the need or the want to go to war in the first place. And so in a better debate, this would not be the grounds of contentment. So the burden on Gov and Op here, respectively, is incredibly simple. On government, it's really simple. There's the societal impact of the veteran depictions that are positive are more damaging than veterans not having a parade to welcome them home, okay? And so on opposition here, the burden is that the positive depiction of veterans is somehow incredible, and how it benefits the veterans themselves in any shape or form, in any tangible shape or form. And so I'll be going on to my substantives now, but before I continue, are there any POS? Okay, thank you. So, my first substantive on how veterans are not good people, okay? There are three layers of analysis here. The first on that, when you be a soldier, when you take on the mantle of being a soldier, it is then in that moment that you begin to forego your morals. When you are forced to kill and mutilate in the name of your country, in the name of war, you immediately forego your morals. And so from there, what does that mean for you? It means that if you're gonna die tomorrow anyway in war, you might as well do what you want, right? It means that you have the capability to carry out these sick fantasies or anything that you want to do in war, because it's all in the name of war. It means things happen, real world examples, like the rape of Nanjing, or the Japanese soldiers using Korean women as comfort women. It means that soldiers exploit these trying times to express their cruelty, to carry out these things that they would never have been able to carry out in normal settings or in settings without war. And so these are the impacts of a good depiction of veterans, right? It means that there is a lack of accountability for these abhorrent war crimes that they have committed. It means that nothing happens no accountability happens for these soldiers who have done such things. There was almost no coverage about the rape of Nanjing. There was almost no coverage about comfort women until 100 years later. And Japan still celebrated their soldiers after the war. They still celebrated the things that their soldiers have done in war, and nothing has ever been done for these comfort women. Nothing has ever been done for the victims of the war. And that is the impact of a positive depiction of these veterans. It means that victims of war, people who are completely defenseless, have not been done justice. Justice has never been served for them. That is the impact of a positive depiction. And so my second substantive on the glorification of veterans, and therefore of war, overshadowing the carnage and the things that have happened. Why veterans are glorified or even depicted as good people? Because when people see that you do good things in the name of your country, in the name of quote unquote justice, you are seen in a good light because you are fighting for your country, you are dying for your country. And when we depict that as a good thing, when we depict veterans as good people, that is what happens. Victims of war are overshadowed, and veterans are associated with the army and the government in charge of said army. This is where my characterization comes into play. There is a halo effect that surrounds these veterans when they are perceived positively, and as a result, the government that sends them out to fight are perceived positively. You are seen as making the good decisions, if not the right decisions. And so we should trust the government. We should trust the decisions that they make. We should let them send out soldiers to kill people and rape people in countries that are entirely defenseless, right? And so governments exploit this sort of positive association with veterans to further military interests. There are three ways that they do this, right? The first is interference in global conflicts. The US sending soldiers into Afghanistan. It looks like justifying military strategies that, however cruel, are somehow quote-unquote effective because we see the government as making the correct decisions. And so when they do these sorts of cruel and unnecessary decisions and commit borderline war crimes, we still see them as justified. We still see them as right because if there's a positive depiction of veterans, we think of the government as positively as we can as a result, and we think that they're making the right decisions, even if deep down we don't agree. We believe that, oh, this is the best decision that could possibly make. Okay, I'll take it here, right?
If there was no war whatsoever, do you think these soldiers would still be bad people?
No, I do not believe. I can believe that these soldiers can still be bad people. However, they would not have the means to carry out the abhorrent actions that they do. They would not have the means to carry out the war crimes that they do because they don't have a situation to exploit. They don't have a war to exploit to do the things that they do. Okay, and how this affects. It means that there is a lack of accountability for these soldiers as a whole. And so how does this affect society's perception of war? It means that we support military strategies that could be incredibly cruel and unusual and abhorrent. And it means that we're apathetic towards military-focused politicians because, Donald Trump actually didn't send politicians to war, didn't send soldiers to war. And so we entirely disregard that in the name of Biden, who has sent soldiers into war. But we completely disregard that because we are apathetic towards we are apathetic towards war as a result of our positive depiction of veterans, of the government, and of war. And that means that people usually just don't care about how presidents keep interfering in these conflicts, they keep interfering in global conflicts, such as going to Vietnam in the 1900s for what? Oil, okay? And so there is it also glorifies the war in the eyes of the people. It means that people like war. People want to go to war. If you see that a veteran, has been glorified for the things that they have done in war and they have never been held accountable for their horrible actions, it means that you yourself, you look at this person and you think, I want to go to war, I want to be a soldier, and I want to send myself off to die. And for those reasons and more, I am so proud to propose. Thank you.
All right, I'll begin my speech in 3, 2, 1. Okay, panel, understand that both sides here agree that war is bad and war crimes are always going to happen, right? So I think the team that takes today's debate, right, is the one that proves to you that they can hold these warmongers, these governments, more accountable for starting wars in the first place, right? And the team that wins is the one that's going to be the ones that shows you in a post-war world how these veterans are going to have better, more fulfilling lives, are going to be able to reintegrate into society better. Before I get into framing and substantive of my own, let me start with some rebuttals, right? Government tells us that people forego morals when they join the army. Now, understand, panel, that these people are not necessarily going to be bad all the time, right? If there was no war happening in the first place, they would not be committing these atrocities. Understand that it is the circumstances of war, right? The very fact that they are put in a situation where they have to fight for their lives, where they have to kill other people. I'll explain later why, they completely lack agency in these situations, where they have to kill other people and do all these terrible things, is why they do these in the first place. If there was no war going on, these people are unlikely to become psychopathic criminals in real life committing crimes like this on the streets. So, people are just not going to behave bad ordinarily, and it's only happening because there's a war in the first place. So if we can prove to you, right, that, on our side of the house we get less war happening, I think we can take the debate on this metric. Number 2, victims of war are going to become overshadowed, and if veterans are seen as good, then victims go forgotten and things like that. While we concede that this is true and this is always going to happen in any form of war, understand that, after these atrocities and crimes have been committed, it's not for us to seek reparations from the veterans themselves. Again, I'll explore on why they have no agency, and it's really the governments and the nations that put these soldiers to war, that send these people to go there and commit crimes, take confirmed women, and allow the things like the rape of Nadzari to happen. These are the people who should be responsible to pay reparations and to somehow give some sort of closure to the countries. I'll take one later. Give some sort of closure to the victims and the nations that have suffered, right? So these reparations again come from governments, not from the people, and not from the actual people who were there on the ground committing these things. All right, let me get into some framing of my own. Right, why do wars happen in the first place? It's because of governments pursuing their own private agendas. I think as much as I hate my neighboring countries I am unlikely to want to go to war with them, because that's just not what a lot of people want to do. People go to war because governments, they use things like propaganda, and they want to fabricate information to force people to accept a war, to go get into a conflict for their own private gains, whether it's something like, to exploit those countries or to just, get resources or things like that. Second piece of framing, why do people join the army in the first place? Understand, panel, that college is extremely expensive for a lot of people, right? People join the army because for them, they don't see a lot of better alternatives. Sometimes, it's just circumstances that force them to join the army in the first place, and there are things like government propaganda in place that tells you that it's glorious for you to join the army, that you are fighting for your country, that it is justifiable for you to do these things if you join the army in the first place. Third piece of framing, how much agency do these soldiers actually have when they join the army, right, when they are in wars? Understand that the military-industrial complex is extremely oppressing, right? When you wake up in the morning and you have things like, your commanders, your superiors yelling at you, demeaning you, dehumanizing you, and treating you like, treating you like soldiers, understand that these people have very little freedom, right? So this means they don't really have a lot of agency, especially when you're in a war, right? When you're in a war where you have to force to fight these people, something that again you would not choose to do on your own. It's because you've been forced to join into the army. It's just that you don't have the ability to make these choices for yourself. For the most part, they are forced onto you, and it's not your fault. What I'm saying is that it's not the fault of the soldiers, rather it's the army and the military-industrial complex that is forcing these things on these people. I'll take a POI right now.
Then is it not people's fault? Is it not the veterans' fault when they literally put a skewer through women in the rape of Nanjing?
It is, of course, their fault, but again, as I said, these circumstances are extreme, and they did not choose to go to Nanjing and put a skewer through women. They were sent there by their countries. They were sent there because of the military-industrial complex and forced into those positions. Again, I said ordinary people would not want to go to war. I mean, of course, some people might be psychopathic and want to do things like this, but these people are going to be in extreme cases, right? Most people do not want to do this. It's because of the military-industrial complex and the private agendas of these countries and governments, right, that force them into the situation in the first place. How do they impact materialize on our side of the house? Number one, I think when a veteran goes back home after Vietnam or something like that, and people view him on the other side of the house, when people view him as a complete villain, as responsible for all the crimes and atrocities that is really the fault of the country, of the government that sent him there in the first place, these people view them as being villains and just not some people that they should respect. How does this reflect on them? Understand that these veterans, when they come back from war, they've seen a lot of terrible things. They've seen their friends die. They've had to kill other people because they're forced into that position. So they're probably suffering from a lot of PTSD and things like that, right? And now you have society, people, your own citizens, viewing you as a villain, just completely outcasting you and ostracizing you and things like that. This is going to be really difficult for them to reintegrate back into society, right? And I think they suffer from mental health issues after coming out from the war. This is going to exacerbate that effect, and it's going to be really difficult for them to live ordinary lives after that. Number two, I think on our side of the house, right, when we tell you that it's veterans are not the people at fault, when veterans are good people, right, and it's the fault of the countries, these are the countries that you should be looking at, you alleviate the burden from these veterans, right, who again, I've already told you, have enough problems on their own, are suffering enough, right, and you shift the blame towards the government. Alright, so what does this look like? Veterans stop becoming scapegoats, right? Let's look at America, for example, after the Vietnam War, when people are unable to actually to say things against the government, things like because they know that the war was unjust, they know that their brothers, sisters, and family members are going off to a foreign country to fight and die and kill other people. But if they blame the veterans for these problems, what exactly does that solve? That doesn't do anything except for make lives worse for these veterans, right? Make it more difficult for them to reintegrate back into society. I think rather, if we accept that these veterans are not the people at fault, it shifts the blame towards the government, making sure that people can hold the government, right, more accountable for their actions. Again, I've already told you that it's the government that is forcing people into this situation in the first place. It is the governments of the nations that want to pursue their own personal agendas and start these wars and conflicts for their own private aims. And when the blame is put onto them, this means that lesser wars are going to happen in the future because people are more aware that it's the fault of these people, right? They know that people don't want to go to war. It's not some mad frenzy that people go to war, but rather for these own private agendas that are happening in the first place. I think for all those reasons, I'll take today's debate. Thank you.
I'm gonna start my speech. I'm gonna start my speech in 3, 2, and 1. The carnage of war and the amount of violence people go through every single day, the moment the government tells you it is time to go to war, is something that is inexcusable on opposition and something they've completely ignored, and we're unwilling to engage with the consequences of it entirely. But I think we have to first tell you what the depictions of the veterans of good people actually looked like, right? Because firstly, this is a retrospective motion. They cannot just say you're going to see veterans as people with morals who are going into tough times and situations. You have to talk about how it has actually played out in status quo. And in status quo, historically, these people are not seen as people who have been forced to do bad things, that war is entirely bad. No, these people are seen as people who are serving their country and serving their nation and doing good things for the interest of the people, which means then these people are not going to be seen as doing bad things. The things that they are doing by association will be something considered or be seen at least in a more positive light. Secondly, there's also no incentive for the people in power who have been pushing this kind of depiction and propaganda to even say that they were doing bad things, like that they were good people doing bad things in the first place. What the government has told you time and time again is that they are put into difficult situations, but it is for the good of the people. Unless they are able to prove why their specific characterization of what the depiction is, they're unable to debate on those grounds. But I think secondly, we have to talk about how the mitigation and how we're going to be able to actually protect veterans, right? Because they're talking about reintegration of veterans into society, but they're unable to analyze the issues of why veterans are unable to integrate into society in the first place. Obviously, there's one obvious factor of them having horrible mental health and PTSD, but you also have to understand it is the lack of government support in status quo, even though there has been such great depictions of veterans in the first place. I think then what is the mechanism that we are going to use to try and mitigate this issue? Because firstly, you must understand that no matter what the depiction is, government still needs soldiers to join the army. What happens then when people realize that veterans are no longer seen as good people and they don't really want to join? It means that the government is forced to give really good incentives for people to join the army, giving them support systems and safety nets so that they're able to reintegrate back into society on not just a mental health level, but also on the literal level that they're able to afford a house even though they've been jobless for the past 20 years. These kinds of incentives would only exist and play out on proposition because we are the only ones who force the government to give better incentives. So if you want to talk about protecting veterans, you're not helping them either. I think lastly, then you have to talk about how they want to say, oh, soldiers are only bad people and are only doing bad things because of circumstance. I think that the issue here is not that these people are bad people or good people. The issue here is that they have done bad things, that they are victims of these crimes. The circumstances don't excuse you from your actions, even though you are a veteran, even though you were forced into these positions. It was still in the end your choice to rape a harmless woman and a civilian and to kill people that just didn't deserve it in the first place. It means then what happens on opposition is that because people glorify veterans and they overlook all of their actions, there is no sort of accountability. There is no mechanism coming out from them when they say, oh, you're supposed to blame the government. They don't tell you why people would blame the government, and I think because we have proved why veterans are associated with the government in general and the army, that there will be no sort of accountability otherwise. But before I move on, are there any POIs? Okay, moving on. Then let's talk about the glorification of war in a more serious matter, right? On how it actually affects society's perception, right? Because when you realize when the government what happens basically is that the government is going to exploit this positive association with veterans to further military interests. I think specifically this plays out in very cruel and self-private driven interests as we characterize. For example, when the US government decided to interfere in the Afghanistan-Taliban conflict simply just because they wanted to leverage off this situation and get oil. I think this means people are more likely to support these kinds of military strategies, not just because they see veterans as good people, but more likely so they see war as something that is in their interest. And this is applied and has happened before, right? And historically in the US, people just didn't care when presidents kept interfering in conflicts. For example, the Vietnam War, which was basically a proxy war, by the way, so that they would be able to further their own interests. But I think more importantly, it glorifies war in the eyes of the people. And from here, I'm going to prove why war is going to be minimized on the side of proposition and why there's a net benefit that opposition cannot claim. Because for the first reason, one, when veterans are no longer seen as good people, people don't want to join the army. Why? Because everybody seems to hate you, right? Sure, we're going to trade off the fact that people are not going to like you if you're a veteran. I think it is more important then, it's important because people don't want to become veterans, they don't want to become soldiers. That means here that people are less likely to join wars. No matter what incentives governments are going to try and give, it means that people aren't going to want to join either way. So the people who want to join will be protected sure, but it just means we're gonna have less soldiers. And when you have less soldiers and less mobility as an army, you're not gonna be able to keep dispatching random you're not gonna be able to keep dispatching random groups into different countries for every single conflict you want to do. This means here you're going to firstly minimize wars of interference that are completely unnecessary to the government's interest, or actually protecting the sake of actually protecting the interest of the people. And it also here means that generally you're gonna minimize war because you don't have enough soldiers to fight, right? But this means it's so important here because we all agree that war is a bad thing, and if war is a bad thing and it's something you want to minimize, it is something that opposition cannot claim, something that only government is able to provide a mechanism for. But before I move on to some world comparatives, any POIs? Okay, I'm going to take that as a no. So what is the comparative then in this debate, and why is this so crucial to how we win? Because on opposition, they still have to defend status quo. What status quo looks like is that when you glorify veterans, you glorify war. Not only that, they're not able to gain any sense of protection for these veterans because veterans are already suffering from issues of not being able to buy a house in status quo, because of them being homeless and being left out on the streets, something that they've never been able to mechanize and prove how they're able to solve the issue, right? When we've already given you the comparative of how we're able to better give veterans better incentives from the governments by forcing their hand. But I think then the more important comparative is how people perceive war and veterans as in general, because when you no longer glorify armies and you no longer overlook the crimes and the crimes of the war crimes and anything that violates the Geneva Convention, basically, you're going to firstly have soldiers realize that they are unable to make these sorts of horrible actions and decisions in the first place, because they know the more they do this, they're going to have to face some sort of accountability, whether it be social accountability by the people back home who are going, what on earth did you do when you were in Vietnam, or by just basically the government being forced to make them take accountability because of societal pressures. I think secondly then, it also because we're able to minimize war, because nobody really wants to go to war, guys. When we're able to minimize the amount of war that happens in status quo, we're basically able to win this debate. For the side that doesn't want to have war anymore, and for the side who realizes the actual societal impacts of glorifying veterans, we're so clearly the winning side.
Okay, starting my speech. Oh wait, first, am I audible and clear? Loud and clear? Okay, nice. Okay, I'll be starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. It is important to recognize that coming out of war, there are no victims, but mainly only victims. Well, yes, you can say that the direct victims of the soldiers themselves are victims as well, but you have to recognize that these soldiers themselves coming out of war are also an inherent victim that we on our side also want to protect, in addition to any other sorts of, in addition to the victims of the atrocities that they may have committed under the guiding hand of the government who enlisted them in the first place. So before I continue, just a bit of outlining of what I'll be doing today. Firstly, I'll be telling you a little bit more about our case, and then I'll also be rebutting to what has come out of the Prime Minister and DPMs insofar, right? So our entire case, we're just trying to tell you why necessarily, the reason why these soldiers go to war in the first place, it's not necessarily because they want to, right? It's because they have to. It's usually more coercive than it is voluntary or willing. Because you have to recognize that regular average people aren't likely going to be wanting to put themselves in the line of danger, knowing that they are going to die in the process, knowing that there is a great risk that is going to come from it. So usually the only way these people are going to want to join in the first place is if you give them, is if the situation is very coercive, if you have no other choice, if let's say they've been fed propaganda all of their life and they buy into that propaganda and therefore they go into it thinking that, oh, this is for the sake of my country and things like that. The point being here is that these people don't go into the war, don't become soldiers for the sake of, oh, let's go commit some war crimes, let's go rape some people. They don't do it because of that. They do it because they're led under a false impression, particularly because of the people in power, particularly because of the people who are waging this war in the first place, who are allowing the grounds for these atrocities to be there. I'll take it later. They're allowing the grounds for these atrocities to be there in the first place, i.e. the government, i.e. the people at the top. The reason why we don't want to shift the focus, or we want to make it so that these people, these soldiers, these veterans are viewed as good people in a better light, is necessarily because once you vilify them, or once you take that away, right, the problem is not now you're going to be blaming every single atrocity on these people themselves, on the veterans themselves, when in reality it's not the soldiers' fault. It's just more of the situation that they were put in, and who caused the situation in the first place, who allowed that to be a situation by which, as the Prime Minister has said, that would allow these soldiers to commit such crimes, that would put them in such a position where they don't care about what happens to them anymore because they're going to die tomorrow, and therefore they're going to like commit sick fantasies. What puts them in this situation in the first place, and how can we remove that situation is what we want to address here. So necessarily, once you take the brunt of like the blame of the atrocities off the shoulders of these soldiers, you likely are going to push the narrative more so that it's focusing on the people at the top, on the governments in the first place. Okay, so I'll take a view now before I continue.
Children of abuse often grow into adults who are also abusers. They have to face consequences for the crimes of abuse. Why don't veterans have to do it too?
You do realize that just by proxy of going into the war and coming out of it, they are also victims. It's not that these people are going to come out of the war completely unscathed. It's not as though these people are going to come out of the war with no harms and no scars in the first place. Yes, although they may have committed crimes, we're not saying that we're going to absolve them of everything that they have done. But the reason here is that we don't want to vilify them to the point. We don't want to prosecute them when the people we should be prosecuting in the first place for committing these atrocities are not them, are the people at the top. Okay, so this leads me to my first point, right? Yeah, a little bit more of extension on the points, right? Because these people are just soldiers on the ground. They are just nothing more than a weapon by which these atrocities are committed in the first place. Like if a murder has occurred, for example, you don't prosecute the weapon itself. You don't prosecute the knife the murder was carried out. You prosecute the person holding it, the person willing it with the intention. And in this case, it is the people at the top actively ordering these soldiers to go into active battlefields, actively allowing these soldiers to take, like, let's say, for example, comfort women, actively allowing these atrocities to happen in the first place, right? Secondly, right, they often have, okay, I've already touched about how they have very little say in the actions that they've committed themselves because of the situation that they've been put in. But secondly, when we talk about like the post-war situation, right, about how these veterans come out of it with like severe PTSD, usually the most anti-war people, the people who will champion the least for war, are veterans themselves who have come out of this war in the first place, because they recognize that because of all the atrocities that they have gone through, because it's not as easy as just simply like taking a life and then moving on from it as though nothing's happened. Because the reality of it is that these soldiers are going to be facing an intense, like, let's say, like moral dilemma within themselves in the first place. It's not easy taking a life. It's not going to be easy recovering from the sites of committing these atrocities. It's not going to be easy for them to recover and be moving out of like a war back into regular society in the first place. Okay, yeah. So we don't want to view them necessarily like as heroes. We're not here to prop them up as like some sort of like as some sort of saint in the first place. We just want to make it so that these people aren't outright vilified. We want to make it so that these people are just seen as just regular people like you and me who happen to be put in bad situations, who happen to commit bad actions because of the bad situations that they were put in the first place. Secondly, right, when we talk about victims and how like about seeking reparations from Gov, like when you talk about like the Korean comfort women or the rape on Nanking, the problem here is that we don't want these soldiers to become a scapegoat for the government, because the problem here is that you don't want to necessarily persecute like the soldiers on the ground. You want to persecute the government in the first place that allowed these atrocities to happen, that greenlit these atrocities to happen in the first place. So rather than having these, like, for example, like seeking reparations from the soldiers themselves, we would rather have them seek reparations from the government of the country themselves. Because even if you do seek reparations from like the soldiers themselves in the first place, there is very little that these soldiers, these veterans at that point can offer you as any sort of reparations. It would be much better and it would be much more beneficial for the victim in the first place to seek reparations from the government of the country that has allowed these atrocities to happen in the first place. Okay, yeah. And so the problem here is that if you allow like the vilification of these veterans to happen, of these soldiers to happen, is that oftentimes any sort of atrocities that do get committed are just likely going to be scapegoat and just like pushed, and it just it would just be pushed onto them, and we don't want that to happen, because the problem here is that once that does happen, right, it absolves the government, the people at the top, from necessarily being held or taken accountable of their actions in the first place. It pushes all of this accountability on the soldier, on the shoulders of the soldier in the first place. We're not saying that in our world that all of a sudden like these soldiers are pariahs, they are untouchable. No, of course there can still be some form of accountability to be held, but we don't want all of the brunt to be pushed on these soldiers who are in the first place nothing more than just like, for example, like who are nothing more than just an agent to carry out these things, rather than the person behind it, rather than the structure behind it that was willing these atrocities to happen in the first place. We want to at least redirect some of that blame or some of that accountability back on the back on the institutions that can actually provide more reparations to the victims in the first place, on the institutions who carried out these atrocities in the first place, i.e. the people at the top, i.e. the people at the government. Keep in mind that these soldiers, these veterans, at the end of the day, are people just like you and me. They don't go into this for the sake of killing people. And when they do kill someone, when they do commit these atrocities, they likely don't come out of it completely unscathed either. And because of that, they've already suffered enough for everything that they've done. So rather than persecuting them further and squeezing out what little left they have to give, we would rather you do that and go straight to the government instead. Okay, so for all of these reasons, proud to oppose.
Alright, for your final speech. Now I speak for the government.
Can you hear me loud and clear? Yeah. Okay, thank you. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. Panel, you have to realize that opposition, if they want to win today's debate, they cannot choose to debate on the parts that actually help their case. They cannot pick parts of the case, parts of war crimes that undermines the people that actually die if they want to win today's debate. Okay, you have to realize, right, the very first speaker came out here and explained to us that their burden is the very same one that we want to have. It is that we don't want people to die, we want to lessen wars, right? And that's the exact same burden that they have to actually defend if they want to debate, if they want to win today's debate. But and so far as we are in this debate, right, we don't see any mechanism as to how they're doing it. They just tell you that they want to shift that blame to governments, but they don't actually tell you how that is going to happen. They don't tell you how that is actually going to benefit the people on the ground. They literally show you nothing except for telling you that they want to shift that blame to governments because veterans are not the people making the decisions. It is the government that's making the decision. But we don't see how when you shift that, how you shift that blame, right? And they also don't tell you how when you shift that blame, it necessarily changes anything. We don't see how their case comes into play in today's debate. But anyway, let's go through parts of the, go through their case part by part, right? Firstly, they want to talk about how most people don't want to go to war and how these soldiers are victims too, right? Okay, then we explain to you why when they tell you that people don't want to go to war, they don't explain to you why that is actually better on their side of the house. We already explained to you why under our side of the house, when people necessarily see wars as not a nice thing, a thing where people die, thing where people suffer, where people who don't make decisions, people who don't do anything, they're innocent, they die. We tell you that people don't want to go to wars. Therefore, the wars are mitigated under our side of the house, not their side of the house. So we tell you, they don't show us why that is true. But secondly, right, they tell us that people don't want to go to war. We already explained to you why they would want to, because now when these veterans are seen as good people, seen as people who actually want to support their country, to fight for their country, we tell you people would actually want to do it because they see it as a good thing. They see it as protecting their own country. We tell you that cannot be true under their side of the house. But secondly, right, even if we explain to you why that urge to do it is already compounded under their side of the house, but even so, right, think about it. If the soldiers of my country go fight for war, right, don't you think that I think of them as like, they go fight wars. For what? For oil. Don't you think that I'm going to think, oh wow, they're going to help our country? So yes, I'm very much more inclined to want to go to war, just like they do. No. But anyways, let's talk about it. The PTSD that they so want to talk about, right? They tell you that it's important, but we tell you why that is not important. We tell you, when they come up here, they tell you that PTSD is important. We tell you, they don't necessarily explain to us how that harm is mitigated under their side of the house. They don't tell you how they're going to do it anyway. But then, they want to talk about how they want to have reparations, right? How they want to shift the blames to government, right? We don't understand how that reparations come into play. We don't understand how that actually exists under their side of the house. They tell you they want accountability. We don't see how that accountability can actually exist under the other side, under their side of the house. They're now with their third speaker, and we see literally no mechanism as to how any parts of their case can actually happen. They tell us that they want to shift the blames to government. We see none of that happening. We don't see how accountability and reparations towards these veterans can exist under their side of the house. So we tell you their case can fallen. Anyways, So let's talk about how they want to depict these veterans as good people, right? And how they want to shift the blame, right? We tell you the even if first. If you want to see them as good people, it literally does not prove your original burden that your leader of opposition came out here and told us, which is you want to minimize war crimes and you want to minimize the fact that people are literally dying. They don't actually show you that. They just tell you that they want to shift it over to the government. So what the government's going to do? Do you necessarily think that the government is going to do anything to change that? Obviously not. But anyway, let's assume a world where the depiction of veterans as good people is more important than destroying the rose-colored lenses that society has on when looking on war, right? We tell you, firstly, it is not important. We tell you that people will still go to war because they think of it as a good thing, because they see veterans as doing something that is good and beneficial for their country. We tell you that is not true. We tell you that that is problematic coming from their side. But secondly, we tell you why it overshadows the carnages of wars, right? We tell you it's so problematic for you to come up here and tell us that veterans are good people, and then you tell us that war crimes are so bad, you want to minimize the number of people who are dying, but you don't show us how you do it. You just tell us you want to shift that blame to governments, but you don't necessarily tell us how that can actually exist under your side of the house. But even so, we tell you the societal impact of the depiction of veterans is far more damaging than no one walking these veterans home when they come back from wars. We tell you their case is necessarily problematic. But in anyways, we tell you that the glorifications of veterans itself overshadows the carnage of wars, right? We tell you when you think of veterans as like good people, you're going to overshadow the impacts that wars necessarily have on people on the ground, because these are literal humans who are dying because of the wars that they have no say at. These are the same things that will continue to exist under the outside of the house, because people think of veterans as good people, people think of them doing good things, they think of wars as a good thing. They think they think of it as a good thing. But so, if they want to tell us that now people think of veterans as good people and the government is bad people, right? They can change that. We tell you that it's not true, because how likely are they going to be able to change that? People aren't going to just think of veterans as good people and then think of governments as bad people and then go, oh, we're going to overthrow this government and make this world a better place because now our country is not going to go to war. We don't see how that actually plays in this debate. But anyways, we tell you that it's also not going to happen because you just can't. The government aren't going to listen to you anyway. But so, on the our side of the house, I'm going to explain to you why only on our side of the house, wars can be reduced and less people can die. We tell you, people don't see veterans as good people, right? People don't see them as good people doing good things. We don't see them as people where they're going outside fighting for a small thing for our country, and then they're killing literal thousands of people dying, both in our country and other people's country. We tell you that it's problematic because people are literally dying. It's not important for you to think of veterans as good people and then trade off the fact that literally millions of people are dying. We don't see why that is important. But anyway, secondly, under our side of the house, people see wars as a bad thing. People see that when people die, it is bad because they're humans, and that is something that opposition has to engage with if they want to win today's debate. Because insofar as they tell you that veterans are good people and they don't show you why wars can be minimized under their side of the house, they lose this debate. But so yeah, okay. Continue. So right, you think of it this way: when you depict veterans as like good people, right? For what sake, right? It's like your country goes to war for like oil, and then it literally doesn't make sense for you to tell me that your country's fighting for something, and then you think of them as good people, and then your people die, and like millions of people die. I don't see why that's a good thing. So, panel, it's very simple. The side that literally has less people dying, we win this debate. Thank you.
Panel, understand there have been explicit problems coming from side government in this debate. So what do these problems look like? First of all, they seem to insinuate that anyone who joins the army is straight away foregoing their morals, is instantly bad. Why is this problematic and why is this not true? First of all, we've already outlined very strongly in our case why this isn't true. Because first of all, who are the people that join the army? They seem to think that everyone who joins the army are people like us, middle class people who probably have knowledge of the war crimes that go on, people who have other options to go to. They seem to think that people who join the armies are people that could have become a lawyer, could have become a doctor, but this is simply not true. I think everyone knows here that most people who join the army are people who are not well off to do, people who have nothing, who have no other career options, people who cannot afford college, people who do not have access to education, people who do not have access to trainings to get other jobs. So a lot of people are forced into the army in and of itself. So I think it's unfair to straightaway label people as bad people simply for doing the only thing they can that allows them to live a life, because they are given money, they are given housing, and they are given food when they join these things, as opposed to what, dying on the streets. So people are still dying if they don't join the army. So I think it's unfair to instantly label these people as bad people. So what are the problems coming from side government? Another thing is that they seem to think that war crimes are something that will be justified on our side. It doesn't happen, because in the status quo, military courts still exist. The Geneva Convention still exists. So individual war crimes are still tried on our side. We're not saying that just by depicting veterans as good people, we're going to suddenly say that everyone who has committed a war crime isn't bad. If it's investigated and if it breaches the Geneva Convention, these people are still arrested, and that is proven in status quo, because why else would the Geneva Convention exist? So I think the only way that the only angle they have to argue is on the big war crimes that are forgiven by the government, such as like the rape of Nanjing and things like that, because other war crimes are still tried in status quo. So why is it the rape of Nanjing is something that still can be mitigated on our side? Because as it's stated, even in status quo, people know about the rape of Nanjing, so it's not something that's really covered up and no one knows about. So why is it on our side? It's much better, because when we shift the blame for the rape of Nanjing onto the government, we are proving we are actually actively targeting the people who allow these things. So why is that good? Let's move on to the metrics. So the two metrics we think that this debate is taken for is who best opposes war and at least holds the people who mete out these war crimes accountable, and the second metric is who best takes care of veterans, because they are still an important stakeholder in this debate. So let's start with the stakeholders, with the veterans, because they are the most immediate stakeholders. So why is it on our side we've proven that they actually are taken care of? Because on our side, sure, they are still not given every single privilege that they should by the government. That is true, that they are not living perfect lives. But on our side, because they are not always vilified in media, because they are not always told, oh, you're wrong, you're a bad person, why did you do that? These people actually they are more likely to be able to actually live their lives and actually see their neighbors and talk to their friends without having to be shunned and without having be feel like they don't belong in this world and have to commit suicide. What is the actual counterfactual that looks on that side? They don't actually prove. Okay, the one thing put forward by government on how they'll make these lives better is like they'll manage to challenge the government and get them more housing, but that's not really true, because if you are proving that these veterans are bad people, don't you think the citizens who suddenly see, oh, veterans are bad people, but suddenly the government wants to give them more housing, give them more privileges, won't you say, why are you doing that? These are bad people, give them less things. So on that side, actually, people are more likely to oppose giving veterans better stuff, because the people actively vilify these people. They're saying, if they're bad people, why are you giving them more money? Why are you giving them free housing? So in terms of that, the government is actually going to probably less incentive to help these veterans post-war. And let's talk about the veterans in themselves. They also like to circumvent this by mitigating the amount of people that will join wars. But they haven't actually outlined how this would happen, because they say that, oh, most people won't want to join war because they see veterans are bad. First of all, this is already problematic, because I've already mentioned a lot of people don't have that choice. Even if they know war is bad, they know that they'll become bad people when they join the war. What else do they have? Starve on the street and die. I think a lot of people would rather kill someone else than let myself die. So a lot of people will still join the war anyway. And even if they had a choice, why would they still join the war? It's because on that side, they don't really prove how seeing the veterans as bad people would deter you from joining the war. Because let's say like they put the point of the war is to claim oil. So if you will join the war, if you agree with the point of the war, you'll join it anyway. If you see these people are bad, but you still agree with the point of the war, why would it suddenly deter you? If I hate Muslims and I want to kill the Muslims in Middle East, just because the people who join the war are bad doesn't mean I want to stop killing Muslims and I still join the war. So I'm not sure why showing that the veterans are bad changes people from whether or not they agree with the government's decision to go to war. And let's talk about so that proves why exactly we best protect the veterans, because we show you how we lower the stigma and actually allow these veterans to reintegrate into society and actually show why they are not going to be vilified by people on the ground.
So you agree that soldiers do go to war to perform whatever hatred they have against minorities, then how then do you have accountability for these horrible people that you claim exist?
No, because I think it's fair to say on both sides there exist people who are bad and people who are good in the army. Because even in real life, there are citizens who don't commit crimes and citizens who do. Because of this large amount of prisoners and people who commit crimes, are we going to label all citizens as bad? I don't think so. So we show you on our side, we at least protect the very innocent veterans who have no part in these war crimes, who have no who've actually done no wrong, and we show you why we protect them on our side instead of actively vilifying them and probably getting governments to give them less things in order to please the citizenship. So let's move on to the second metric, which I think is the most important one, on war and how we hold people accountable. We've already shown you why we hold the governments accountable, because we've proven the metric that people are more likely to blame the government when it's shown in the light that these soldiers are only actively following orders, that these soldiers are the people who are forced to do things by the government. And it's already proven in real life because governments have paid reparations. Like even Japan, for all the war crimes they committed, they've paid some reparations to Malaysia, they paid reparations to Asia. Whereas, what would the counterfactual look like on their side? Because they haven't really proven, this is a retrospective debate, they haven't really proven how the world will look like. Let's go back to militaries in the medieval times. Like, people would have gone to war anyway because of conscription. Let's go back to World War II. People would have joined the war anyway because because the Germans were very evil and vilified in the media. So it doesn't matter whether people agree with the army or not, they hated the Germans so much that they would have joined the war anyway. So they don't really prove how they get less people to join the war on their side, because we've already proven that it's not really a choice that people join the army because they have no other things to do. And it doesn't decrease the amount of people who want to go to war, because if America wants the country's oil, just because their veterans are painted as bad in the media, doesn't suddenly make America not want to invade Middle East anymore. So they haven't actually proven why they get less war on their side. And we have shown you why on our side we've gotten countries to hold the governments accountable, and it's worked because these governments have been blamed for it, they've paid reparations. But on their side, when people keep blaming the veterans, it's so easy for the governments to basically shift the blame and scapegoat and say, the government did not order that, this was up to the discretion of the soldier, and therefore now we've given him a punishment, and I think all is settled, we don't have to pay any reparations. Would that not be the more likely case on side government? I think that's why it's most problematic, because they actually decrease the accountability put on the government and the actual people who do need to pay reparations. So I think for these two things, we take today's debate proud to oppose.
Alright, thank you for the fine speech to conclude the entire opposition case. I'd like to provide the opposition reply.
Okay. Alright, I will begin my speech in 3, 2, 1. Okay, first let's talk about the clashes that have happened in this debate so far, right? Number one, about the mitigation of war. Which side necessarily mitigates the problem of war more? First, what we've heard from government insofar is that the glorification of war, that there is a much higher glorification of war on our side, and therefore more people are going to want to join the war efforts and therefore become a part of the war in of itself. But we've already told you why necessarily people, normal average people like you and me, are not likely to want to go to war in the first place because of the high risks. We've already proven this to you in both our LO and DLO speeches in the first place, right? We've told you about how generally that these veterans who have come out of war are usually the ones who are the most anti-war in their own messages. So therefore, if you hold these veterans in high esteem on our side of the world, you generally take their account into more, you generally give whatever they're saying a bit more weight. So if they are anti-war in of themselves, they're likely going to be spreading a message of anti-war in the first place. And if you vilify them even more on our side in that case, then you have a message of anti-war being spread in the first place. So in that sense, So secondly, in that sense, we win over this clash over government in the first place. Okay, secondly, right, when we talk about reparations for the victims, right, about how we get reparations for the victims is on government side is that they talk about how they're going to be persecuting the veterans of the war in the first place. And we follow the same mechanism of the principle of societal pressure to necessarily enact some sort of change on both sides. However, on our side, rather than saying that we want to persecute these individual war veterans, we want to persecute or rather claim accountability from the government overall, rather than necessarily just these soldiers on the ground, as what has been put forth by government in this case. So because of that, generally, if you're going after these veterans, even if that is trade, you can get some form of accountability from these veterans in the first place. It's likely not going to be very much, because as I've already pointed out in my speech, what have these veterans left to give to you in the first place? If you seek accountability from the government, it's likely this government with their infinite resource, with a much higher resources than these vets in the first place, are likely going to be able to give you better reparations. And it will feel better for the victims as well, because now you're being reparated by the country, by the government itself, rather than just the individual overall. Okay, secondly, right? Alright. Okay, so what's wrong with the case that has come out of government here today? Note that there is a little bit of tension between the Prime Minister and the PM speech, because the Prime Minister said that the reason why these war crimes get committed in the first place is because these atrocities happen because soldiers are going to die. They know they're going to die, so therefore they don't care. Therefore they're going to act out all their sick fantasies before they die. But then in PM speech, they say that because of the societal pressure, when people like actively shit on these war veterans, they're not going to be committing these crimes anymore because of societal backlash. Unfortunately, but because of what PM has already said, because of what PM has already characterized, your point cannot stand in this case. Because if they know they're going to die, then I don't see why the boon of like having societal backlash is going to hold water in that case anyways. Okay, secondly, so now what have we said and why do we win? Okay, so on our side, we've told you why we best oppose war, right? Because first we shift the narrative of like sole veteran accountability onto government accountability. Note that we've already told you that on our side we can also hold these war veterans accountable if there is a need, but we don't want the entire narrative to be around these war soldiers, veterans having to be the sole person to have to pay reparations for. We want it to be more so that it's the government in the first place. Okay, second, right, about the government's point about glorification and why this is necessarily a wash on both sides. Because even if this is true, right, the government is likely, if a government is going to be wanting to pushing like a very heavy like war sentiment, they're likely going to be using other forms of propaganda. Let's say, for example, like vilifying other countries, for example. So this is likely also going to be happening on your side anyway. So your delta of change here is very minimal, and whatever benefits you can claim from it is really not that big of a difference on our side in the first place. Okay, so for all of those reasons, opposition.
For the final speech to conclude this final and golf case, I'd like to invite the government reply.
I'm starting my speech in 3, 2, and 1. When you shatter society's rose-colored glasses, they are forced to see the truth, that war is carnage and it's ugly and it's completely unjust. A few things I have to call out first though before I can move into the real issues in this debate. Because the first thing and the main thing is the lack of sufficient engagement in this debate coming from opposition, right? When we told you we're going to minimize war, there was no response until like maybe last few seconds of whip and in reply. There was also an analysis on the halo effect that associates governments and bring them into a positive light. There is no response, which completely takes down their idea of accountability, right? Because they claim they would rather shift the focus from veterans to governments, but so long as they are still associated and therefore in the halo effect and seen in a positive light, there will be no accountability coming from the citizens. They can't claim any of these impacts or any of these mitigations if they cannot directly contend with our analysis coming from first speaker in the first place. But I think then there's also the idea of just protecting veterans in the first place, right? Because even though WHIP tries to tell you that, oh yeah, that's completely impossible and I didn't really get the response either way, we've been the only ones who are able to solve the issue, an issue that's supposed to be opposition's issue, mind you, but we're the only ones who give you a mechanism on how that will work and how it's going to force governments to give incentives. But I think secondly, there's also somehow new material on WHIP, because they tell you that only poor people go to war. This is great analysis, by the way, but you can't credit any of that because it came out in opposition WHIP, and there's no way for any of us to respond. And also somehow they give us new analysis on how veterans are bad people anyway, which like helps our case, thanks, but like still can't be credited. Thirdly, also I feel like there was engagement in reply, because they kept pointing out a tension and how it's going to take down our case, but this kind of tension, even though it may or may not exist, cannot be simply credited because it was said in reply, and there's no way for any of us to respond. Then what does this debate actually boil down to? We tell you, government tells you 3 things. Number 1, that veterans can be bad people and therefore should suffer the consequences of their actions. 2, that the societal perception of war is going to be something that can only be changed when you tell people that veterans are no longer good people. And lastly, on how we're able to minimize war and just like get people to not want to join war in the first place. The one opposition directly contends with us is when they say they would rather persecute governments than veterans because they are coercive and like because these things are coercive into. Fine, even if you take it on their best case and say veterans aren't bad people, like veterans aren't bad people because they're forced into these circumstances, there still exists the issue, right? Where is the accountability for the victims that have suffered and who have died? They've never been able to answer that question. Simply telling me that the Geneva Convention is going to persecute these crimes isn't going to work, because the Geneva Convention doesn't have all the time in the world to persecute every single veteran who raped a person. But I think secondly, on the idea of societal perception, they challenge this by saying that veterans would say that war is bad, and even though nobody actually listens to these veterans and they simply just glorify them and see them as good people. But even if we didn't give you anything, right, there's been no legwork from them to tell you why people are going to listen to veterans when they say war is bad, because they've never been able to tell you why veterans specifically would be spotlighted and understood by society. But lastly, the idea of minimizing war, which I think is the most important point of this debate, because we all agree war is bad, we all agree that people suffer when there is war, no matter if it is the victims or if it is the soldiers. But then we are the only ones who give you mechanisms on how we're minimizing war, simply because we're the only ones who prove to you that, hey guys, if veterans are seen as bad people who have done bad things, people don't want to become those very same veterans who do bad things, something they cannot engage with at all. We're gonna take them on their best case here then, and tell you, even if none of this is true, why we still win. Because their best case here is that, sure, we're going to shift this focus from veterans to the governments and society. But then comes the question, what happens then? Where is the mechanism for you to have accountability? Because they don't give you justice, because they don't tell you why they're able to do anything in this debate. They stand on one principle alone, and we tell you that is not enough, because principles don't matter in war. Here.
Alright, that concludes the final round for high school categories. Thank you for the debate. Now, most like is applause, shake hands. Yes.